going into great length, what has happened in Ukraine over the last couple of years? Well, we had the overthrow of the elected president in February of 2014 by a violent political movement that was a complex movement of different interests, different social classes involved, even in some respect conflicting interests, but who all agreed on the violent overthrow of the elected president of Ukraine and the establishment of a new right-wing government. This violent movement to overthrow President Yanukovych was allied closely with extreme right-wing and even fascist paramilitaries and political parties. And that alliance of ultra-conservatives and of extreme rightists is who governs Ukraine today. And I don't call Ukraine a fascist government at all. It's an ultra-conservative government, but it's certainly a government that leans heavily on the extreme right in order to govern, but also to police the streets of the country. Parties have been banned, newspapers have been banned, television stations have been banned. This is by far the most grave attacks on democratic rights that exist in Europe today. And then we saw the events in Crimea, which I don't have time to go into, but basically the people of Crimea reacted to this change in government in Kiev and said, we don't want to be part of a future right-wing and anti-Russia Ukraine. That's not our Ukraine. We were obliged to join Ukraine back in 1954 by an administrative decision. Our experience in Ukraine has been very unsatisfactory, including since Ukraine's independence in 1991. Sorry, Ukraine's second independence in 1991, when the Soviet Union dissolved. So we want out of here. And that was the decision of the Crimean people in March of 2014. A referendum vote conducted by an elected representative government to secede from Ukraine because the Crimean people just did not want to be part of this Ukraine that was taking shape. And they didn't want civil war in their territory. They didn't want to happen in Crimea, the very thing that began to happen a month later, beginning in April of 2014 in the east of Ukraine. And part of the civil war drive by the Kiev government was to impose an economic blockade against the east of the country, and that blockade remains in place today. Despite the ceasefire agreements of February 2014 reached in Minsk, Belarus, in which there's a very specific clause that economic, well, they don't put it in these terms in the Minsk agreement, but the economic blockade must be lifted by Kiev. That's just one of the many violations of the Minsk ceasefire agreement. There is today an economic blockade against the people of Donbass by the Kiev government, including the cessation of social payments, pensions, all these sorts of things that was cut off more than a year ago, and that remains in place. And this blockade really just kind of mirrors the economic sanctions that have been levied against Russia by the Western powers since the events of Crimea last year. And we have foreign soldiers on Ukrainian soil at the invitation of the Kiev government. The United States, Britain, and Canada have soldiers in Western Ukraine operating. They're doing what they call a training mission. Now, this is in violation not only of Ukraine's constitution, which prohibits foreign troops from being on national territory, but it's a specific violation of another of the clauses of the Minsk agreement of February 15th, which says there can be no foreign soldiers in Ukraine. And then, of course, Ukraine itself, that is the Kiev-led, the Kiev government has proceeded with an economic association with Europe, which is an austerity association agreement. They've imposed deep austerity in Ukraine during the past 21 months. So that's a sketch of what Ukraine has become since the overthrow of the government in February of 2014. Now, the roots, there's really, I think, three broad sources of the conflict in Ukraine. One are the tensions over economic orientation since 1991. Ukraine became transformed after 1991, where the remnants of the socialist economy were done away with, privatized, done away with, and you had a new, rather harsh capitalist regime arise in Ukraine, similar to the harshness of the capitalist regime that became imposed in Russia during the 1990s. That regime changed in Russia with the coming to power of President Putin at the end of the 1990s. It didn't change in Ukraine. You have a Wild West capitalism still prevailing in Ukraine, and the economy of Ukraine is very much owned, operated, and run by the wealthy tycoons of Ukraine that emerged out of the privatizations. Because remember, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the largest privatization binge in history. And so the people that rule Ukraine today economically are those who happen to have their hands close to economic power at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. They took full advantage of it. And since that time, there's been a great tension over, well, what's our economic orientation? We, the new Ukrainian capitalists, should we retain our close economic ties with Russia, or do we want to have an association with Europe? And remember, this is not the Europe of the 1960s and 70s, the glorious days of, you know, social welfare in Europe. This is the Europe of austerity. This is the Europe that's stripped Greece of its national sovereignty. That's the association that, you know, these Ukrainian capitalists looking towards Europe wanted to have. And so there was a tension for 25 years between different sections of Ukraine's economic elite, between who, you know, with whom do we ally ourselves most closely economically. And those were never resolved. But as the Yanukovych government during the year 2013 sort of had all kinds of doubts and hesitancies about exactly which way to turn, this provided an opening for the really aggressive pro-West, pro-EU section of Ukraine's economic elite to say, okay, we're going to end this discussion, we're going to drive for association with Europe, and we're going to do this on a very harsh anti-Russia political basis. And that's what they did. They took advantage of the Maidan protests, which, remember, in their origin were quite, you know, legitimate protests in many respects, of people who were fed up with the economic inequalities of Ukraine, fed up with the corruption, fed up with the seeming lack of a real future, a lack of a real plan for the country. So the Maidan protests arose, and they arose because President Yanukovych made a last-minute decision to pull back from an agreement with Europe, because the consequences for ties with Russia were going to be quite extreme. And so the country just split in the middle over this. And the pro-Europe extreme, the pro-Europe conservatives and economic elite, but also the extremist nationalist wing in Ukraine took advantage of the chaos around the Maidan protests and drove hard for this overthrow of government and installation of a pro-Western, pro-Europe government. So that's the first set of circumstances that created this. Secondly are the unresolved historic divisions in Ukraine, and in particular over the legacy of the Soviet Union. That is, the Soviet Union is a different kind of country founded on principles of social egalitarianism, and I leave you to determine just how much the Soviet Union actually achieved those, but nonetheless this was the declared historic aim of the Soviet Union, and then specifically the experience of World War II, when Ukraine was invaded by Nazi Germany. And a section of Ukrainian society, a minority of Ukrainian society, was supportive and sympathetic to the Nazi invasion and proceeded to collaborate with them. So this historic division, which is deeply profound, I mean, we're talking about villages where, one side of the village was killing the other over allegiance to the Nazi German occupiers versus the Soviet Union armies that fought and resisted the Nazi invasion. That profound historical division was not resolved in post-World War II Ukraine, and it simply worsened in post-1991 independent Ukraine. And so again, the Maidan movement was an opportunity for the extreme right wing, which identifies, with the collaborationist past and also with the anti-Soviet and, call it also anti-Russian past. These forces took advantage of the chaos and confusion at the time of the Maidan protests to drive very hard, forcefully for their agenda, which was to eliminate the Soviet legacy of Ukraine and embrace this legacy from World War II. So that's the second set of factors. And then the third is the historic drive of the NATO member countries to weaken and dismember first the Soviet Union and then Russia. And I say dismember, this is not their openly proclaimed goal, but just look at the Middle East. What do they do when they invade and overthrow governments? What's their aim? It's to weaken and divide. Well, in the case of the Russian Federation and the Soviet Union before that, it means dismembering it. So there's 4 reasons why we should be concerned about Ukraine today. Firstly, really for the first time since World War II, we have a country in Europe where extreme right forces rule the streets. They were a very central driving force in the civil war itself in the east of Ukraine. Because the average Ukrainian army soldier at the outset of the civil war in April and May of 2014, the average soldier was refusing orders to fire on their fellow civilians in the east. That is, the Ukrainian government invaded the east of Ukraine to shut down the protests against the overthrow of the government and the installation of the new right-wing government. Well, the Ukrainian army was ordered to shoot protesters, as they did in Kiev at Maidan Square, as they did in Odessa, to shoot these people if they won't shut up and go home, because this is the new Ukraine and they must put up and shut up. And so the Ukrainian army proved not effective in this civil war that the Kiev regime wanted to wage, and so they welcomed these right-wing paramilitary, call them armies, that were really in the forefront of the civil war in the east of the country. So in the first time in Europe, in decades, we see a very prominent role being played by extremist paramilitaries in the streets of the country, and also penetrating the police, the army, and the other institutions of the country. Secondly, this hostility and aggression by the Ukrainian government has created a threat for the world, because they are threatening and wishing to, this is their words, the Ukrainian government, they want to go to war with Russia. They want to convince the rest of the world to go to war with Russia. Now we're talking nuclear-armed nations here going to war, so the threat of this for the world is intense. Thirdly, a reason why we should be concerned is Canada is very much a part of this, and not just the Harper government. I'm sorry to say here that the new government in Canada, the Liberal Party, and even I have to say the NDP, it's shameful for me to have to say this, but even the NDP share the goals of the Harper government in its aggression against well, I'll say against the Ukrainian people, but this aggressive stance towards Russia. And we have a very strong pro-Kiev lobby in Canada, extremely powerful, and one of its most influential spokespeople. Not someone being influenced, a person in the forefront of the pro-war lobby for Ukraine is now the Minister of International Trade and Development in Canada, Chrystia Freeland. She's not just someone who agrees with this, she's actually one of the ideological spokespeople for all this. So lots of reasons to be concerned. What's happening in Ukraine, and not at its outset, because you can see it's a much more complex thing, but it fits into what's happening in Europe, which is that the wealthiest countries of Europe have decided that the European Union as an egalitarian institution will no longer exist. The dominant economic powers, Germany, France, Britain, some others, will dictate the economic terms of how the European Union will run. And so Greece, as we know, has very much fallen victim to this new EU, where national sovereignty doesn't count for anymore. National sovereignty goes, the countries that get national sovereignty are Germany, France, Britain, a handful of others, maybe Belgium, maybe Sweden, but the rest, are in an economic association where austerity rules the day. We have to change this. We have to study this part of the world, learn from the history, learn about the dynamics today. We have to get involved. We have to get our anti-war forces to join, become part of a movement of opposition to the NATO threats against Russia, to this ongoing effort to subordinate Ukraine itself and make it just an economic colony of the European Union in the same way that they're trying to do this with Greece.